Today we're looking at the 13 most lopsided draft trades of all time. So we're talking basically any trade that has to do with the draft. And in this video I guarantee you're gonna remember that some players weren't originally drafted by the team you thought they were. And you're gonna find out things you never knew that would have changed NBA history as we know it. Like with our first example, so back in 1976, Hall of Famer Gail Goodrich left the Los Angeles Lakers as a free agent to join the New Orleans Jazz. And all was good with that, but due to league rules at the time, the Jazz had to give LA compensation for taking their player in free agency. So the Jazz sent over 3 first-round picks, one in 1977, 78, and 79. Well, in only his second year with the Jazz, he tears his Achilles, so they then go on to finish with one of the worst records in the league, which actually turned that 1979 first-rounder that the Lakers now owned into the first overall pick, which, wait for it, the Lakers used to draft Magic Johnson. So yeah, that one hurts. The Jazz could have had Magic Johnson. But for as bad as that was, the Denver Nuggets have done pretty bad over this past decade, because they made 2 franchise-altering trades that are just tough to look back on, because they drafted both Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell, but then traded them away for nobodies. The duo that led the Utah Jazz into multiple deep playoff runs, the Nuggets just traded away. Back in 2013, Denver took Gobert 27th overall, but then traded him right away for Eric Green. Rudy Gobert for Eric Green is about as bad as it gets, or so you would think, because then 4 years later in 2017 they draft Donovan 13th overall and traded him right away for Tyler Lydon and Trey Lyles, 3 guys who combined only ever had 1 season scoring in double digits, while Rudy and Mitchell have combined for 13 seasons in double digits. I understand this happening once, we're gonna see that a lot throughout this video, but to happen twice within a 4-year span is just so hard to look back on. But speaking of things happening twice, sure, the Jazz wound up on the lucky end of that one, but as I mentioned, they gave up Magic Johnson. But they weren't done there, because just 6 short years after trading away the pick that became Magic Johnson, they actually drafted Dominique Wilkins 3rd overall. And when he refused to play power forward like they wanted him to, they traded him away for John Drew, Freeman Williams, and $1 million in cash, in what's now considered to be one of the most lopsided NBA trades of all time. So just think, the Utah Jazz could have had themselves a duo of Magic Johnson and Dominique Wilkins. But it gets worse, because 3 years later, both Karl Malone and John Stockton were drafted to the team, so we're talking a big 4 of Magic, Wilkins, Stockton, and Malone had Utah played everything right. Now this next one's not nearly as bad, I don't know if any trade is, but it still hurts and is actually hurting a team right now. And that was for back in 2017, when the Boston Celtics had the 1st overall pick. The Philadelphia 76ers traded up and got the 1st overall selection in exchange for the 3rd and a future 1st rounder. So they were drafting 1st overall that year and selected Markelle Fultz. Then the Celtics drafted Jason Tatum like they had planned to do already. They just moved down because they knew the other 2 teams weren't going to take him. But this one's just so painful for Philly. Not only did you have an opportunity to draft Jason Tatum and chose Markelle Fultz instead, but you traded an extra pick to get him, basically sending Jason Tatum and a 1st away for Markelle, and we all know how that one's turned out for both sides. It was actually just a year later that another terrible draft day trade took place, because teams just never learn, and it was when Luka Doncic was traded for Trae Young and a 1st. I've talked about this one a lot recently, so I won't waste any time, but the Dallas Mavericks clearly won this trade. And speaking of the Dallas Mavericks, a lot of people forget that Mavs legend Dirk Nowitzki was actually drafted by the Milwaukee Bucks, and the deal couldn't really have gotten any worse for Milwaukee, because they traded Dirk Nowitzki and Pat Garrity to Dallas in exchange for the 6th overall pick, Robert Traylor. Robert Traylor went on to play 7 seasons in the NBA, averaging 4 points a game, and Dirk became an all-time great and a Hall of Famer. It's just weird to think about from Milwaukee's perspective, because after this deal, the Bucks only made it out of the 1st round in the playoffs 1 time for the next 21 years, until Giannis led them to the Eastern Conference Finals against the eventual champion Toronto Raptors just recently. Aside from that, they were a pretty terrible team for a long time, and it all stems back to this one deal and not having Dirk Nowitzki on their team. But actually, that one time in 21 years that the Bucks did make the playoffs was through the lead of Ray Allen, who only ended up getting to Milwaukee in the first place because of another terrible lopsided trade. You see, we have to go back to the 1996 draft, where the Bucks took Stephon Marbury 4th overall. Well, immediately afterwards, Ray Allen was drafted by the Timberwolves, and himself and Andrew Lang were traded for Stephon. So we actually live in a world where Ray Allen and Stephon Marbury were traded for each other. And as we know, Marbury wound up being a good player on bad teams, had attitude problems, and eventually got kicked out of the NBA. While Ray made all of his teams better, couldn't have had a better attitude, and eventually became a multiple-time NBA champion. And the crazy part about this one is that the Wolves had just drafted Kevin Garnett the previous year. So within 2 years, they drafted both Ray and KG, and were that close to having them as a duo together before they ever eventually got together 12 years later. later. We would have gotten to see them both in their primes, and who knows what happens to Minnesota from there. But as we mentioned, this all took place in the 96 draft, which is crazy because a little later that night, another one of the most lopsided trades ever took place when the Hornets drafted Kobe Bryant and then instantly traded him to the Lakers for Vlade Divac. And this is one of the most popular ones, so I won't spend much time on it, but it just always gets me because it was such a Hornets thing to do. And the fact that Divac only played for them for 2 seasons while Kobe did what he did always makes it that much worse. I made a point though to not say it was the most lopsided draft trade ever, because I had to reserve that spot for this next one, which was when the St. Louis Hawks drafted Bill Russell 2nd overall, and then immediately traded him to the Celtics for Ed McHale, who was an all-star at the time, and Cliff Hagan. 2 players who were both good, but nobodies when you compare their legacies or even their name value to Bill's. And there was no luck involved in this one because Boston drafted 3 Hall of Famers that night, including Russell. Just think, it's probably the Atlanta Hawks with 11 NBA championships and made known as one of the better franchises in the league today had they not have made this trade. But it seems like the Celtics have always had guys in charge who knew exactly what they were doing, and it's how they managed to get Bill. And that one's another one that's a little more well known. Most NBA fans will know that one, but I'm sure a lot of fans may have forgotten that Kevin Love was actually drafted by the Memphis Grizzlies. But right after he was selected, himself, Mike Miller, Brian Cardinal, and Jason Collins were sent to the Timberwolves in exchange for OJ Mayo, Antoine Walker, Greg Buckner, and Marco Jaric. Now listen, Minnesota without a doubt won this deal, especially with the fact that Mike Miller was included in it, and even though the team was still terrible as a whole after it went down, and they never made the playoffs with Kevin Love, the deal itself was definitely the rare win for them. And speaking of Kevins, the deal that brought in Kevin McHale to the Boston Celtics was just as bad as any in this video. You see, back in the late 70s, the Warriors had been struggling for a few years, so they wanted a fresh start. So they traded Robert Parish and the 3rd overall pick in that year's draft to the Celtics for their 1st overall pick and the 13th. And with those picks, Golden State selected Joe Barry Carroll and Ricky Brown. Their 1st overall pick, Joe Carroll, had some good years averaging 20 a game and was a one-time all-star, while Ricky Brown was basically a nobody. But then you look at the Celtics side of things, and with that 3rd overall pick, they draft Kevin McHale, who became a 2-time 6th Man of the Year, a 7-time NBA All-Star, a member of the 75 greatest players of all time, and a Hall of Famer. While Robert Parish also thrived after the deal and became a 9-time All-Star and a Hall of Famer. And due to the fact that both men had teamed up with Larry Bird, they all won 3 championships together. While again, Joe Barry Carroll was a 1-time All-Star. So yeah, Golden State really couldn't have made a worse mistake in this situation. The Indiana Pacers made a pretty bad mistake themselves when they drafted Kawhi Leonard 15th overall, then immediately traded him away for George Hill, who was a role player before this trade and stayed one afterwards. Not too sure what Indiana was thinking or even seeing in him, but it cost him a superstar Kawhi, who eventually became a 2-time Defensive Player of the Year, a 5-time All-Star, 2-time NBA champion, and 2-time Finals MVP. To just think the Pacers could have seen this duo of defensive heavy small forwards play together over 10 years ago is wild. And speaking of defensive minded small forwards, back in 1987, maybe one of the most important lopsided trades of all time took place, when the Seattle Supersonics drafted Scottie Pippen 5th overall, then immediately traded him for Olden Polynice. Had Pippen and Jordan never teamed up, Jordan never has the amount of success that he did, and he admits that. If this trade doesn't go down, we may not be referring to MJ as the greatest of all time, and maybe the dominance of the Bulls in the 90s never happens, because Scottie was that guy that allowed Michael to take his game to the next level. And just for reference, here's a list of Scottie's career achievements, and here's a list of Olden Polynice's career achievements. If you enjoyed the video, like, comment, and subscribe, and I'm out.